Hi, kinesiology students. This is part 2. This is the posterior skeleton, and we are going to go through the different bones that are located here on the posterior side. So some of this will be a repeat of the anterior side, so I'll skim through that, but we'll focus on some bones we didn't catch on the anterior side. So here we go. On the posterior side of your skull, you have two bones. So we had our frontal bone, and then we have two bones that are here on either side of our skull, and those are our periaxial bones. Our periaxial bones have a suture down the middle, but they make up the more superior part of your skull, and those two parts are called your periaxial. They're in two parts, so the periaxial. And then on the more posterior side, but more inferior side, is your occipital bone. Your occipital bone is there at the base of your skull, and your occipital has that protection duty of really the base of your brain, which is an important part in a lot of our just day-to-day functions, breathing, etc. You have probably a prominent notch there in your occipital bone, or some of you do, at least I do, right at the base of your skull there, and that's a prominent notch, but that's a good way to palpate and feel your occipital bone. So you got your frontal, your periaxial, your occipital, and then your temporal on either side of your skull. Then we get into your spinal cord, your spinal column, I should say. The different vertebra in your spinal column are each individual bones that make up your entire spinal column. There are irregular bones that kind of allow us to be able to have that flexibility in our back that we enjoy. So we have numbers attached to them, but also we have a letter attached to our vertebra, and they are grouped in according to their letter and according to their number. So important thing to note. So when we point to vertebra, we need a letter at minimum, and we need a number as well when we label them properly. So we have 7 what we call cervical vertebra. The cervical vertebra are the vertebra that make up your neck, okay, the neck structure. So when we are flexing, extending our neck, we are, these cervical vertebra are what we're actually moving. And you have 7 of them. They go from the superior to the inferior. So you have cervical vertebra number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7. Number 7 is like the most prominent one. It's got this spinous process that really articulates out, points out, and you have you can feel it there at the base of your neck if you feel it properly. C1 and C2, cervical vertebra 1 and cervical vertebra 2, have special names. We'll look at in a second. It's your atlas and your axis. So your atlas is C1. Your atlas is where your entire skull rests on your atlas. And if you know the Greek legend of Atlas holding the world on his back, you can kind of picture that your entire skull is resting on your atlas there. That's another name for your C1. C2 is your axis, and C1 and C2, that's where if you are rotating at your neck, then you are rotating there at C1 and C2. So they have a special function called the axis, and you can see why. They're turning about an axis there. Then you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. So these are called your thoracic vertebra, and they are more inferior to your cervical vertebra. So this is like your upper back, and we noted on the anterior side that all of your ribs are articulating to thoracic vertebra. So you have thoracic vertebra, or T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6. There's T7, T8, T9, T10, T11, and T12. Now, I'll pause here and look at something we talked about on the anterior side, but note your floating ribs here. Your final 2 ribs, number 11 and number 12, they show up much better on this side, and you can see how they have no articulation at all to your costal cartilage on your anterior part of your rib cage. But they do articulate to rib number 11 articulates to T11, and rib number 12 articulates to T12. So those are your thoracic vertebra, T1 to T12, and make note that they all articulate to a rib. You have 5 vertebra on the lumbar side. So these are your lumbar vertebra right here. The lower 5, they're the largest of the vertebra. The cervical are the smallest, and then the thoracic, and then the lumbar. And then you can imagine why it's kind of that ideal load-bearing strategy where the heaviest ones would be taking the most load there on the inferior side. So again, we start superior to inferior, and this is lumbar vertebra number 1, lumbar vertebra number 2, L3, L4, and L5, right at the base of the spinal column there. Okay, so letter number. So we got C1 to 7, we've got T1 to 12, and then we've got L1 to L5. So keep that in mind anytime you're labeling it, letter and number. We've got your sacrum here, pretty prominent on the posterior side. You can see those foramen a bit better. And it's kind of hard to see. Try to move this a little bit. All right, that's a little bit better. But you have your coccyx down here, at the very bottom. This is your tailbone, okay, is your coccyx, and it's on the most inferior part of your spinal column. This is your coccyx, very tiny, and you can do it later on your own time by yourself, but pretty prominent when you feel in between the cheeks there. You can feel that coccyx bone pretty prominently. It's your tailbone. Okay. Note the spelling. It's one of those that has a Y for a vowel, so C-O-C-C-Y. X is your coccyx, and it's the most inferior part of your entire spinal column. Before we leave this part and then go to the lower body, this is a very important bone here, is your scapula. Your scapula is this large triangular shaped bone on the posterior side of your back, and it articulates to your humerus. And your humerus is obviously that long bone here in your upper arm. There's a large acetabulum here in your scapula. That is a very prominent feature of it as well. It also has this long spinous process on the posterior side of the scapula. And then obviously there's an anterior side of your scapula that kind of moves around the posterior, the more posterior part of your ribs. And so when you elevate, flex your arms, the scapula will move with it as well. And so it's just an important thing to note. It does move around a little bit, but it's an irregular bone, but it's very prominent. You can feel that spinous process of your scapula pretty well if you palpate your back. And, you always got those people that can kind of wing their shoulders, and their scapula pops out a little bit. So that's your scapula. I already made note of the humerus on the anterior side. We made note of the ilium on the anterior side as well. We made note of the femur on the anterior side. We made note of the fibula and the tibia on the anterior side. Now this diagram is showing us a couple more things over here, and these have to do with the more distal part of your lower leg, and the medial malleolus and the lateral malleolus. Those are not bones in and of themselves. They are landmarks. They are the most distal part of your tibia and fibula. So the medial malleolus is the most distal and the most medial part of your tibia. Okay? And really, why do we make note of it? It's a very prominent landmark. It's part of your ankle bone. So if you feel on the medial side of your ankle, I'll try to show you here. On the medial side of your ankle, you've got that very prominent bone, part of your bone of your tibia, and it's called your medial malleolus. Okay, so your medial malleolus is that most medial distal part of your tibia. You also have a lateral malleolus, and it is the more lateral part of your ankle bone. Right over here. So your lateral malleolus, most distal and most lateral part of your fibula. Okay, so the lateral malleolus is part of your fibula. Just if you think of like, you feel those very easily around your foot. We call those like your ankle bone, but those two together are actually the distal parts of your tibia and fibula. So medial malleolus, lateral malleolus. Then on this diagram here, it's showing you the calcaneus, which is one of the tarsals, one of the tarsals in your foot, and it's your heel bone. All right, so you're pretty easy to palpate there. Your heel bone is your calcaneus. It is, other than your jaw, pound for pound, one of the most strong bones in your foot. Pretty hard to damage because if you think about it, all your weight as you jump and land and kind of slam your heel down sometimes is going through that calcaneus. So a lot of weight bearing builds it up over time. So those are the bones on the posterior side of the large skeleton. So thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll have a few more videos to show you some of the more detailed diagrams of the bones.